Hello, everyone, and welcome to this fireside chat with Matthew Prince, the co-founder and CEO of Cloudflare. My name is Joyce Hakmeh. I'm a senior researcher at Chatham House, a London-based think tank, and I'm the co-editor of the Journal of Cyber Policy. The unprecedented digital adoption that we have been witnessing since the start of the pandemic has shown how important and indispensable digital technologies are. And for the millions of people who have transitioned at speed into a more virtual way of living, the benefits as well as the risks abound. In this chat, we will be focusing on the exponential use of the internet during the pandemic and what the implications of this increased use are, in particular from a resilience point of view. It has become clearer that this rapid and unplanned for digital adoption has brought new opportunities for cyber attacks, whether against critical national infrastructure, including healthcare institutions, to small and medium enterprises, and attacks against the individual internet users. We will look at some of the big cybersecurity trends and lessons that we've learned from this past year, asking about what needs to happen to increase the resilience against these attacks, what kind of mindset, policies, and tools are needed. So I'll be taking questions towards the end of this session, so please do use the chat function to add those there, and I'll try and ask Matthew as many as I can. Hi, Matthew, and it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Brilliant. So as the CEO of a company that works in over 100 countries, which mission is to help build a better internet, what are some of the big trends that you have seen in relation to the internet since the start of the pandemic? How did they impact your work, and how did you cope?
Yeah, this last year has been a remarkably challenging time for the internet, a challenging time for Cloudflare, but also I think a time that has helped us recognize how important the internet is for keeping people connected and keeping them online. This time last year, our team was working around the clock, scrambling in order to make sure that our systems could continue to cope with what was just unprecedented demand for internet access. Over the course of about 3 weeks, on a global basis, we saw in many places as much as doubling of internet demand and a real shift in when that demand was being requested. And so the late Senator Ted Stevens got a lot of flack for saying that the internet is a series of tubes. But as one of the companies that helps make sure the internet continues to flow, at some level, that analogy is a pretty good analogy. The internet is, at some level, just a series of tubes, and those tubes have a finite capacity. And when we saw doubling of internet usage in such a short amount of time, the internet got to some breaking points. And it was only because of the work of a number of companies working together to make sure that in those choke points, in those limited regions, the internet could continue to flow. I think we are still in the middle of a pandemic. There's still a lot of people who are suffering, a lot of people who are dying around the world, and we need to be very cognizant of that. And obviously, the superheroes of this period of time have been, the frontline medical responders and the scientists who have, taken care of the sick and miraculously found vaccines that seem very effective for this disease as quickly as possible. But I think our entire team is proud of the fact that we have been sort of the faithful sidekick along with that. And for those people who could continue to connect with their work, with their loved ones and others in a virtual way, the fact that the internet has continued to work has been one of the things that has really, I think, held a bunch of society together. And I imagine just how much worse this could have been had it happened just even 10 years ago, when we didn't have technologies like this to be able to connect people reliably together. And I think that illustrates how important the internet is, and hopefully will be a lesson that we remember for some time to come.
Thanks, Matthew. You talked about how the internet got to a breaking point and how, a bunch of companies had to work together to keep it going. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? What were the main essential elements to keep the internet going and to not break after all this pressure that you talked about?
Sure. So, I think that the place where we saw local challenges around the world. So at some level, just some background on Cloudflare. So at Cloudflare, we run a global network that spans more than 200 cities worldwide in more than 100 countries. And we make sure the internet continues to flow, both making sure that the performance is good under normal circumstances, and that if there is some sort of cyber attack or cyber event, that we're able to stop that as well. And so I think that there have been a number of different stages of challenges for the internet over the course of the last 15 months. The first was simply a usage and utilization stage. And in various places around the world where internet infrastructure may not be as built out, especially the underlying backbones that connect the internet together, there were definitely points in time where those metaphorical pipes got almost to their bursting point. You can't imagine many public utilities that if all of a sudden they had twice as much usage overnight would continue to function. The sewer system having twice as much usage, the electrical grid, the freeway system, they would all come grinding to a halt. And the internet largely continued to work, although there were places around the world where we really saw strain. Europe was one of those places where a lot of the infrastructure there got right to the edge of its breaking point, and that required companies like Cloudflare, but also other companies that were providing what were some non-essential usage of the internet. So companies like Netflix or Disney, which voluntarily decreased their bit rates for streaming in order to make sure there were just literally less bits flowing through the proverbial pipes to make sure that happened. And I think what was really rewarding about that was to watch as companies that were all involved in making sure the internet worked, collaborated together in order to do the right thing to make sure that those essential bits that needed to flow were available, while still making sure that people could be entertained and could communicate with their families and friends and other things. And I think that was sort of the first stage of the challenges. I think the second stage, which happened sort of starting in midsummer of last year, was that there was then a dramatic uptick in the number of cyber attacks that were launched. At first, they had the characteristics of what we call bored kid attacks. Cyber attacks tick up every year as school lets out, and kids who are sort of smart and don't have anything better to do go home and literally launch cyber attacks to entertain themselves. But unfortunately, it shifted fairly quickly to then targeting what were much more sophisticated attacks, both criminals taking advantage of the fact that more people were working at home and therefore didn't have the same kind of protections that their company might afford to them. And then secondly, unfortunately, in some cases, what appear to be nation state actors targeting oftentimes healthcare infrastructure in order to embarrass some parts of the world, presumably, and slow the rollout of critical care. We saw that. We were super concerned about that. We provided our services at no cost to anyone who is experiencing those types of attacks. And one of the things that we did was actually provide our services to small businesses, nonprofits, other organizations that had people working from home in order to make sure that they could continue to operate, and we did that at no cost because we knew that it was an important thing for us to do. I think the last stage has been really in the beginning of 2021 as countries are really rolling out the infrastructure to deliver vaccines for their populace. Again, we've seen that this requires the internet to be able to coordinate. It's something that we're keenly aware of. We stepped forward and volunteered our services to provide the infrastructure for any vaccine distribution related services through what we call Project Fair Shot at no cost. I think other companies like Hakmeh and Google and Microsoft have also stepped up to do something similar. And I think that's been an important part of making sure that the vaccine rollout has gone as well as it has in the places around the world where it's been able to go well. But we continue to watch with a significant amount of concern regions like India that are obviously still very much suffering, and I think it's important that we recognize that we are still in the middle of a pandemic, and it's important for companies like ours, government institutions, individuals, organizations to all be working together in order to deliver the services that we can in order to help hopefully get through this as a society globally as quickly as we can.
Thank you, Matthew. So you talked about the uptick in cyber attacks, and we have been seeing an increasing number of ransomware attacks, specifically against critical national infrastructure, including obviously the latest one against the US Colonial Pipe. What do you think are some of the elements that are enabling this increase, and what is really needed to disrupt this trend?
Yeah, I think there's sort of a good news story and a bad news story here. So starting with the bad news story, the bad news is that unfortunately there remains a lot of legacy aging infrastructure that relies on out-of-date technologies that are relatively easy to compromise, and we've seen that with a number of stories here. These are not incredibly sophisticated attacks. They are largely exploiting either somebody inadvertently clicking on a link in an email or having used a not particularly secure password. And unfortunately, once an attacker is able to get into some part of the infrastructure, that they are then able to spread out and cause significant harm to organizations, and we've seen that now in a number of very high-profile incidents. That's not changed. That's been the case for a while, and so the question is, what is it that has changed? And I think the potentially good news around this is that I think that the hackers are under the impression, and I think it's a correct impression, that the world is starting to take these sorts of attacks significantly more seriously than we have in the past. And the hackers sort of understand that if all of a sudden you see crackdowns on this activity around the world, then their days of being able to use the exploits that they have are somewhat numbered. And in that sense, I think that you are seeing a lot that is getting thrown at sort of the proverbial wall right now, looking for any sorts of vulnerabilities, because I think that there is a sense in the hacking community that the window for this is closing over time. And the good news is that, as we have seen in the past, actions on a intergovernment level, taking actions to control this, it has resulted in decreases in cyber attacks and hacking. And so I think that as you see governments around the world start to focus on these issues, I'm actually optimistic that we might be seeing the worst of these attacks, and that there might be a sort of optimism outcome on the other side. That said, we won't get through this until we modernize the way that our critical infrastructure is deployed. And the best metaphor that I have for this is that, once upon a time, if you were building boats, the way you kept a boat from sinking was you built the hull extremely strong and thick, and made sure that it was impenetrable. And that's sort of like people who say, we need to write perfect software. I think the challenge is there can always be one bad weld or one weak rivet that, if it's burst in an old school boat, once water starts getting in, you can sink the entire boat. And so what I think the new approach to security, and what we use ourselves, and what our services that we provide to our customers and to our partners through projects like Project Galileo, are what we think of as almost the equivalent of bulkheads in a boat. Because there is always going to be some vulnerability. There will always be some person who accidentally clicks on a link. But when that happens, what you have to make sure is that the damage that can be done from that is contained. So like in a boat, if there's one bad rivet, that springs a leak. If you have bulkheads, that doesn't fill the entire boat with water. That just fills one particular bulkhead, and it is much less of a concern. And so I think that move to a new way of approaching security, which has been known in the industry as a zero trust approach to security. I think that's the equivalent of building bulkheads in a boat. And I think the good news is that we're seeing more and more companies adopt those sorts of solutions, and that can really help us have a much more secure critical infrastructure going forward.
So some of the experts, when they comment on ransomware attacks and the increase, also mention the business model and how it's actually profitable for criminals. That organizations who are being subject to ransomware attacks are sometimes paying the ransom against the advice of law enforcement. So if you don't break that cycle, you're not really able to break the ransomware trend. What are your views on this?
I think that our advice would always be to not pay people who are sending you ransomware. But that's easy to say, today. It's hard when you need to get your systems online in order to process and deliver fuel across the eastern seaboard of the United States. You have to get your systems online in order to deliver critical parts of the food and agricultural supply chain. And so, I think that I have sympathy for the teams at these companies that come under these attacks, and their need to get their systems back online. And so I think that it is important that we break that cycle. But I think it's going to be, even before ransomware, you had lots of ways that criminals were able to, extort other companies. And this is sort of the modern equivalent of the guy walking into the store and saying, you got a great store here. Shame if it burned down. I can make sure that doesn't happen if you leave a bag of cash on the counter. So this is a business model that it extends way beyond and is way older than computers or the internet or ransomware. And so I think it would be great if we can find ways to disrupt that business model. But foundationally, what we should also be doing is working to make sure that businesses are more secure, organizations are more secure, and that we have those tools in a way that is easy to use, affordable, accessible to anyone who's online. And that's really what our mission is at Cloudflare.
You talked about how a lot of the, when you were referring to the bad news, you said the legacy infrastructure is actually making all of these, or a lot of these attacks happen in the first place. And I'm interested in your views as to the tools and tactics that are being used by the perpetrators, because what you said suggests that actually they're not very sophisticated. They just use legacy, or like are benefiting from the legacy, or the lack of cyber hygiene perhaps within employees, that they are able to do their attacks. How would you describe the sophistication of the level of the perpetrators who are inflicting a lot of harm? Would you say that they are increasing in sophistications, using more emerging technologies? Should we be worried about where this might go?
So I think so it depends so it depends on what the target is. If a lot of people who are in the audience for RightsCon have real reason to worry about very sophisticated, targeted nation-state attacks. And in those cases, the goal of the attack is to be extremely precise, to ideally leave no notice that an attack has taken place, and then be able to, usually for nation-state level espionage reasons, be able to observe or thwart or control how somebody is using technology online. And so there are very sophisticated actors out there using what are sophisticated exploits to go after individuals. But that is and we should worry about that issue. But I think that is a different issue than something like the Colonial Pipeline attack. In the case of the Colonial Pipeline attack, the goal is to find an organization that you can get into and then actually create as much chaos as you can across that organization, making it impossible for that organization to do their job. And so while it may be possible to use sophisticated, very targeted attacks, that tends not to align with the business models of those attackers, because once those attacks are known, once they've been disclosed, they get closed down relatively quickly, and so it often is something where, you know, in one case with sophistication you want to be subtle and clandestine. In the case of these ransomware attacks, it's quite the opposite. And so in most of the cases that we're seeing, the fundamental problem is a relatively simplistic type of attack in most of these ransomware cases, and good cyber hygiene is the right thing in order to protect that. I think there is a different set of challenges around protecting individuals that might be targeted by sophisticated nation-state level attacks, but we shouldn't necessarily combine those two things into one category. I think you have to sort of understand what your attack surface is and what your risk profile is, and hopefully those people who, again, are in the audience that are thinking about that they might be targets are already practicing a lot of the good hygiene around password security, two-factor authentication, making sure that that your devices are up to date, and practicing other good protections, because again, I think you do have a different level of security and a different level of threats. But for the most part, the sort of ransomware attacks that we see in the news are, you know, start with and are really facilitated by relatively simple attacks that don't require a level of sophistication that we see in other parts of the space.
If we look at just kind of like moving to the what sort of response is available and what countries are doing to deal with those challenges. So if we look at countries around the world, we see, for example, around over 140, maybe 148 now, countries have adopted cybersecurity strategies. Some of them for the very first time. We see an increased amount of public-private initiatives on cybersecurity, and generally more talks in policy circles about the importance of cybersecurity. So as someone who works around the world, would you say that we have reached the needed level of awareness at the government level to be able to deal with these challenges, or do you think this is still confined to a small number of countries?
Well, again, I think it goes back to what might be the good news out of what feels like a really bad series of events over the last several months, and that is that I think that there is a growing awareness around governments that this is a extremely destructive and disruptive type of attack, which can risk critical infrastructure and risk the health and well-being of citizens. And so, and I think in part because a number of the cyber attackers are concerned about government efforts to crack down on this, that actually is driving more of them to try to cause as much harm in the short term as possible. We have seen even, just in the last several months, a dramatic uptick in both the ransomware, cyber locker attacks, but also DDoS ransoms as well. And it feels almost like a level of just almost sort of almost spastic energy before sort of a coming crackdown on what's there. So I do think that governments are increasingly recognizing this as a concern. I do think that they are starting to think about how to crack down on it. One of the things, though, that I think is incredibly important and critical for this audience to be thinking about is that there will be a temptation as governments around the world start to think about how to control cybersecurity for them to lump in other things such as journalism that they don't like, or dissident behavior there, and try to lump what we've seen time and time again is that sort of the cyber attacker who shuts down a pipeline by infecting a computer gets lumped into the same category as a group that is protesting in the streets over government corruption. And I think that it's important for this community to be watching very carefully as governments take action, and very warily, because again, we have to make sure that the internet continues to live up to its ideals, and as there is government action to try to control how cyber attacks work online and keep them in place, that doesn't slip into other censorship or other ways that governments might want to control how the internet works and how speech is delivered online.
So you're talking about undesirable content and what some governments are doing. And we have a question from the audience here saying that Cloudflare took a bold step in 2019 in removing 8chan. Can you talk about how and why you reached that decision, and whether it's still realistic for infrastructure providers to say that they have no responsibility for content-related issues?
Yeah, I don't think that we or anyone else would say that we don't have any responsibility. I think the question is just where that responsibility lies. So today, about 1 in 6 websites online relies on Cloudflare, but we are the network provider that sits behind them. If you think about the responsibility for content which is published online, the ultimate responsibility is with the individual who publishes that content. Then maybe but below that might be the platform, whether that's Facebook or Twitter or Shopify or any of the other platforms that are out there that sit there. Below that is the actual hosting provider that is below it, and then below that would be someone like us, like the network provider, and then there's infrastructure that sits even below that, like the DNS provider or the registrar. And what I think is important is that as we think about what the different roles are, the answer is not that you don't have any responsibility, but you want to be very careful. So for instance, if we terminate some piece of content which is flowing through our network, but it's also flowing through a particular hosting provider or a particular platform that sits on top of it, we're effectively taking away the agency of those organizations that sit on top of us in order to make decisions that are aligned with whatever their own abuse policies are, their own principles are. And so I think the further that you go down in the stack, the more careful and more deliberate that you have to be in making those decisions. In the case of 8chan, I think that it was one of the rare times where we had individuals that were acting in a way that was completely outside of the values of society. We had a platform that was specifically designed to be lawless, not responsible to either the laws or norms of any societies around the world, and actively trying to thwart the efforts of law enforcement as they invested crimes that were in part at least announced on the platform. You had a hosting provider that was actually, again, it specifically set up to be outside of the reach of any of society's norms or laws. And then you had us that were sitting below it. And so I think in the ideal case, you would have individuals taking responsibility for the content that they create. If that doesn't happen, you would have the underlying platforms take that responsibility. If that doesn't happen, then the host should take that responsibility. And in the rare cases where none of those 4 organizations are willing to take responsibility, then sometimes that's going to fall to Cloudflare in order to take that responsibility and do that. We want to make that something that is rare. We want to make that something that we do very deliberately. That of course then means that there are times when there's content that flows through our network that we're not proud of and that we don't personally like. But we think that it's important to really delineate those different lines in the technology stack and make sure that the underlying internet itself, the network itself, is not being used as a way of censoring what content is online, because that obviously creates enormous challenges and enormous risks for a lot of the reasons that I was talking about before in terms of governments regulating activity on the internet.
So just kind of staying on this topic, what do you think are the likely scenarios that we might be faced with when it comes to content regulation and content governance? What do you think, which way are we heading?
Well, the internet is this massively disruptive force, and I think it's hard to overstate how disruptive to um, to traditional and historic institutions it has been. And for quite some time, there were sort of two models of internet regulation. One was sort of the US model, which I think it's hard, again, to overstate how, radical the US approach to freedom of expression is. And it is not one that is shared by most of the world. And yet, because the internet started there, that radical approach is what has taken hold around most of the world up until now. The other approach was really the Chinese approach, and at some level, the Chinese approach is hard to understand for me as someone who grew up, in the United States. But I think it's actually as I've thought about it more, it's something that maps to what other types of content that are regulated do around the world. So, for instance, if you want to start a radio station, basically anywhere in the world, you have to apply to whoever the regulator is. In the United States, that's the FCC, for a license to be able to broadcast across a certain spectrum. There are rules that allow you have to broadcast at a certain strength of your frequency. And in the United States, there are certain words that you're not allowed to say, somewhat absurdly, on the radio station. Otherwise, the FCC will pull your license. And we sort of all accept that that's the case because, if you didn't have some sort of coordinating body, then there would be chaos, presumably, because you'd have people broadcasting on the same frequency and radio just wouldn't work. That's sort of the way that China thinks about the internet, is that if you want to put something up online that is going to be broadcast from inside of China, you have to have a license to do that. And that license is called an ICP license, and there's a process to applying for it. But it's very similar to if you were applying for a radio license in the United States with the FCC. That, of course, creates a much more of a control plane for the Chinese authorities to be able to control what content is online. And just like the FCC controls what content is on the radio, the Chinese government does that online as well. What I think that the world in general, outside of the US and China, I think the challenge right now is that the world is not totally happy with either of those models for regulating how the internet works. The world is worried about the model of anything goes, which has kind of been the US model in the past. And the world isn't quite ready to go to the Chinese model of we have to approve everything in advance. And so the world, I think, right now is looking for what that new model is. And you have some various centers around the world that are thinking about these issues really well. I think Europe is actually doing a very good job of thinking about how and when and in what ways the internet it should be controlled and regulated. And I think that they have been thoughtful at understanding what the different layers of the internet stack are and why, as you regulate something like Facebook, it may not make sense to regulate, the undersea cable operator, and actually been, very, very, very thoughtful about how to move forward around that, and I think that's the case. I think the challenge, though, is whether or not that coalesces into something that can be a model that the rest of the world can follow. I think the country that I'm watching the most closely, and where I think the likely kind of new model for internet regulation, for better or worse, is likely to come out of is going to be India. India, is I think thinking through. They have the critical mass and size to really be kind of a new anchor for a third way of internet regulation. I think the challenge is that what we're seeing out of it, out of India so far, looks like it is going to err more towards sort of a Chinese model. And I think that's something that we all really need to pay a lot of attention to and think about whether that's something that we want the entire internet to follow. And so I think watch India extremely carefully, and I think that's where a lot of sort of the future of internet regulation is going to be thought through.
Thank you for that. And we have another question here from the audience asking you that if you could erase one or two misperceptions about the internet and the cloud, what would they be?
I used to teach a course on internet technology and privacy law back when I was a not very good law professor. And one of the things that students would come in and they were very idealistic. They sort of had a lot of the same background as I do, and there are just a lot of assumptions on that the internet is this almost infinite resource, and that the way it has been will just continue to grow, and that will be the case over time. And I remember one of the things I learned teaching law was that the same thing that kids enjoyed when they were in second or third grade is the same thing that law students enjoy later on in their careers, which is that their favorite day of class was field trips. And so I would always take them on a field trip to 350 Cermak, which is the largest data center in the world. I was teaching in Chicago, and so we would go down there. It's near McCormick Place off Lakeshore Drive. For those of you who know the city, it's the old Yellow Pages printing warehouse. For anyone who remembers what the Yellow Pages were, and it's turned into this giant facility. And the impression as you walk through that door and you walk through all the security and then the different layers and into the actual facility is like, wow, there's a lot of atoms that are involved, and a lot of electrons that need to flow in order for all these bits to flow. And so I think the first thing I would say is that there is the internet is more costly, and as a result more fragile to administer than I think the average person knows. It feels just magical, but behind the scenes there are a lot of people working incredibly hard to make sure that it stays online. And the reason why that then means that it's fragile is that building 350 Cermak, if it were to go offline for some reason, would disrupt a huge portion of how the internet works. If a government wanted to control how bits fly across the internet and what bits are there, there are still a relatively small set of organizations and places around the world that they potentially can do that. And so I think it is up to all of us to really think about what is the internet, to recognize the fragility of it, and to really have agency as we think about its future, and we think about how it's going to be regulated and how it's going to be connected to, and how it's going to be controlled or uncontrolled. And that is an incredibly difficult set of challenges that I think are some of the most important questions that we can ask, and it's what our entire team and it's what Cloudflare is set up to be a part of hopefully helping solve. When we say our mission is to help build a better internet, that means how do we make sure that anyone anywhere in the world who needs to get access to the network and all the advantages that brings, whether they're publishing content or consuming content, that they can do so in a way that is on the same footing and on the same level as some of the internet giants or some people from wealthy countries or organizations around the world. And I think that if we can do that, that really is the internet living up to its best self.
So speaking about access to your products, the question to you is, do you think repressive governments should have access to Cloudflare products?
Yeah, I mean, it's an issue we really struggle with. We are computer scientists more than political scientists, and so we really lean on the people who are in this audience and then other experts in order to help us suggest what to do. I think generally our approach has been that we're not selling the sort of guns and ammo. We're selling the metaphorical bulletproof jacket, and we do think that providing access to information is something which is important for us to do, regardless of whether we agree with that information or disagree with that information that's online. I think as we start to make what are editorial decisions on who can and cannot use our network, I think it starts us down a path which is a really pretty tricky path for us to head down. We terminated some really vile neo-Nazis from our network, and within the next 7 days, we received over 3,000 requests from nation states saying, "Oh, here are a bunch of organizations that are using your platform that we don't agree with. Either please kick them off as well." And some of those were, most of those actually were very positive. It would be things that we would agree with, and were people who are doing hard work, oftentimes reporting on corruption and other things in the countries where they operate. So I think it's a tough issue, and I think we follow the guidance from the State Department in the United States, which is where we operate, and others, in order to make sure that we comply with any sanctions or regulations. But we are very hesitant to make a unilateral call on, this is a government that is doing something that we don't agree with or we don't approve of, because we worry about the precedent that sets. And again, I think it's very dangerous for someone who operates as low down on the internet as we do to be making a lot of determinations on what content is and is not online.
Right. I have a question for you around sort of the digital divide. And, if you look at this, we talked about the sharp take-up of digital technology during the pandemic, but it has also exposed this widening digital divide, not only between the businesses themselves, but also between countries. And we've, figures from the UN say that almost half of the world's population is still offline. And for those, of course, the experience has been different throughout the pandemic. What, in your opinion, are some of the actions that are needed to help close this divide?
So, there are a number of things that of course we have to do, and I think that we need to make it so that the internet is affordable and accessible to everyone on Earth that wants to be connected to it. I think I try to sort of stay in my lane and talk about those things that we can impact. But one of the things that we're really thinking about and working on is how in underserved communities, often rural communities, and those are in developing countries, but they also can be in developed countries in parts of the world that just the local telecoms haven't prioritized making access to broadband services. But how can we use Cloudflare's reach and our network in order to help facilitate access to the internet as broadly as possible, and make sure that regardless of where you are on the planet, you have access to a fast connection. Now, we can't do that ourselves. We don't make mobile phones. We're unlikely to bid on radio spectrum, but we do want to make sure that if you are a local entrepreneur or a local telecommunications provider that is providing services in rural parts of the world, how can we then help facilitate you providing the best possible experience to all of your customers, and do it in a way which again doesn't disadvantage you because you are living in a developing portion of the world or in a rural part of a developed country, and I think that's something that we can help with, and I think that's something that we are thinking about and working on. And that's that I think is one of the ways that companies can think about how they can provide services to connect more of the world online. In our case, we're in well over 200 countries now. Excuse me, well over 100 countries, well over 200 cities now around the world. The majority of the customers that pay us are in concentrated in the developed world. But we really do believe that our mission is to make the internet accessible everywhere on Earth, and so that's why we continue to build out our infrastructure all around the world. And if we can then use that infrastructure to help support those less connected communities, I think that would be something that I would be really proud of, and that would help be one small piece of helping bridge the digital divide. But there's a lot that we have to do, and I think it's important for every company that's touching the internet to think about how it is that they can provide that and do it in a way that gives people not sort of a dumbed down version of the internet, but a full and complete version of the internet.
Thank you. I'd like to go back a little bit to talking about the sort of public-private partnership that is needed and the collaboration. And going back to all sort of like the increased threats that we are witnessing, what do you think are the lessons that have been learned from recent large-scale cyber attacks in terms of effective collaboration between governments and the private sector? And what do you think the role of the private sector should be? I mean, how is it evolving? How would you like to see it going?
So 12 years ago, Cloudflare was just an idea on a piece of paper, and it took a lot of hard work from all of the team that has built the company into what it is today. But we couldn't have done it without a stable and functioning government that allowed us to make the investments that we needed. And build our infrastructure out and support it and do it in a way that was important. And that's not unique to Cloudflare. That's true of any business anywhere in the world, where you have to work with the greater community and society that you're a part of, and the stakeholders that you serve are much broader than just your investors or your employees. It is a broader set of stakeholders. And so I think something that has been in our DNA from the beginning has been always to ask, how can we work with that broader set of stakeholders in order to provide services? And so we launched Project Galileo, which is the project that gives our services at no cost to any politically or artistically important organizations around the world. We've worked with a lot of the civil society organizations in order to help us overcome, again, our lack of real understanding of what are the organizations that are the most deserving of that, and worked to do that, incredibly well. And I think that that's been a great partnership with civil society. I think the example of, for us, a partnership with government that worked really well was what we call the Athenian Project. In 2016, I think we watched with really grave concern as what I had thought of as a very stable institution, which were elections in the United States, were at least called into question by cyber attack activities around the world, and it felt like the entire way that elections were organized in the United States, where you made it a massively distributed effort where every county ran their own election in their own particular way. While that was a really great a way of organizing elections for sort of the public choice and other challenges of the first 200 years of the country's history, recently that put all of those officials very much at risk for sophisticated nation-state tampering as they went forward. And so we resolved that we had to do something about that. And so we launched the Athenian Project with a simple premise, which was, how can we provide our services at no cost to any U.S. election official that is charged with administering elections in any way. And we can't protect everything. You know, we're not in the voting booth, and if there's corrupt software on a voting machine, that's not something that we're in a position to be able to protect. But we can help make sure that people can register to vote through a website reliably and consistently. They can find out where their polling place is. The districts can report back the results through a secure mechanism. They can then the Associated Press or whoever can actually publish those results out. And so the internet is critically intertwined today with safe and fair elections. And when we launched that, shortly after the 2016 election, I don't think we knew exactly what the uptake would be. And again, I think that there are people on our team who are Democrats, there are people on our team who are Republicans, and we worked incredibly hard to say, we don't care if you're a red state or a blue state or a purple state. We just want to make sure that you've got the tools and technology to keep the institutions that are critical to government online and secure. And I'm really proud of the fact that while there were a lot of things about the 2020 election that were very contentious across the country, cyber attacks did not play a significant role in them, and I think that was because of hard work from Cloudflare, but also organizations like Microsoft and Google, who are providing their services at no cost to governments around the world. And that was a real change from the 2016 elections. And I think that was incredibly rewarding for our entire team. The thing that's interesting about it is, if you're, I think a lot of the people who are in this audience would see that as, of course businesses should be doing that, but businesses sometimes, the business leaders sometimes have a hard time justifying it because they have to, it's time that their engineers are spent building features that could otherwise be spent, for features for big customers who pay you lots of money, or time that the distraction to the rest of what you're doing. But I think for anyone who is a business leader, I will say that there has been nothing which has been better at helping us recruit some of the best engineers in the world, at helping us recruit customers to sign up for our service, than doing what is right on a societal basis and spending the time to work on these public-private partnerships with civil society, and we do those things because we think they're the right thing to do. But it also turns out that those are the right thing to do to attract the best engineers in the world, sign up more customers, and so you can do the right thing, and also have it be the right thing for your business as well. And I think we learned that lesson over and over again, and it's part of why it's easy for us to continue to invest in these areas.
So I have a few questions from the audience. One is saying that last year you joined GNI and committed to working towards the UN principles on business and human rights. Can you speak to how this has impacted the company internally, and what are you doing differently now after you've signed up to this work? So
one of the things that's I think that we have done. I think we are making significant progress in fixing what I think of as the kind of core bugs of the internet. And some of those bugs are that someone who is sitting on a line between you and whoever you're communicating with can, the way the internet was designed, see everything you're doing, see everything you're saying, see everything you're communicating. And so starting back in 2014, when we made encryption free for all of our customers, and that really was that, and then the work from Let's Encrypt and Mozilla and EFF, that those things really turned the tide from something where encryption was only available to those people who could afford to pay for it, to it was available by default across platforms. It was a big deal. We've worked with 1.1.1.1, our DNS resolver, to encrypt DNS traffic, and push much more of DNS to be encrypted today. We're working on encrypting the SNI, which is sort of the information on the outside of the envelope. We're working to actually encrypt the underlying connectivity of how routers connect together, and as a result of that, it is making it much harder for governments to be able to restrict what content flows across the internet, and we're sort of closing down all of those different paths. That said, there are governments that have laws, and those laws in many times, are actually fairly reasonable and well thought out. I mean, it's hard to again, as the American going into Germany and a German government says you should shut down neo-Nazi content, and as a naive American, you might say, well, what about the First Amendment? And I think if they don't roll your eyes at you, a reasonable German regulator will say, well, I understand that is your law born out of your tradition and your history, but we have very different sets of laws born out of a very different tradition and a very different history. And I think you have to respect that. And I think that it's important that governments be transparent and consistent and accountable to the rules that they have in place. But I think you need to respect that. On the other hand, there are times where governments go way too far, and they infringe on what are really the civil rights of organizations around the world. And so the consequence, as we are able to encrypt more of the traffic online, as we're able to shut down a lot of the ways that governments traditionally regulate the internet, more and more of those questions come to us, and we have to deal with them. And again, we operate in all of these countries around the world, and so we have to respect the laws in those countries around the world. But there are times where governments go too far, and you need to set a real floor. And so I think that that's why GNI and the UN are such an important principles for companies to sign up to be able to push back when governments do go too far and say, this is the floor below which we will not cross. And so I keep a copy of that of that document on my desk, and I think it's a constant reminder for us that we do have obligations, and that we have to make sure that we're not falling below what are the basic human rights standards that are online, even as we increasingly have to work with governments around the world.
Thank you. And I think we have time maybe for one last question. And I wanted, because we've been talking about what governments are doing, how you're working with governments, what private sector companies are doing. But what we haven't talked about is like an entire work that is taking place at the UN level, with like two processes, bringing states together, trying to agree on how they should behave with each other in cyberspace. So you had two processes that concluded their work in the last few months, and they managed to agree on what, on the rules of the road, as they call them. Given that some of the biggest attacks have states behind them, what do you think the impact of these agreements will be in real life?
Well, I know it's fashionable to sort of poo-poo these agreements and say they don't matter. But what's been fascinating now has been watching as there have been, bilateral or multilateral agreements between governments, that they actually do then impact how cyber attackers operate online. When the Obama administration and the Xi administration signed a cyber accord, we actually saw a dramatic decrease in cyber attacks coming out of China, even from private organizations and individuals targeting U.S.-based companies. And so, and then the latest example, which is maybe a less positive one, is that you see a lot of the cyber attacks coming out of Russia, specifically coding into their malware restrictions that make sure that they don't touch or target any Russian speaking individuals or companies. And so I think it's important that governments work on this. I think it's important that that these principles get outlined. But again, I would caution this audience to make sure that you continue to watch this, because it will be very tempting for governments to slip in additional censorship and content regulation in the form of cyber regulation. And I think it's important that we all watch for that and try and defend the best of the internet to the best of our abilities.
Matthew Prince, thank you very much for your time today and for this great conversation. And thank you very much for the audience and for all the interesting questions, and all the luck with the rest of RightsCon.
Thank you.